Now we're going to cover access control systems and methodology. Good old domain 3. Within the objectives, we're going to cover access control types and characteristics, identification, authentication, authorization methods, access control models and techniques, single sign-on technologies, centralized and decentralized administration, and intrusion detection. What is the difference between intrusion detection and intrusion prevention?
IDS is to detect and IPS is to prevent.
Yes. A lot of the IPSs, they do the detection, and then when certain things happen, then they start doing a prevention part. The interesting thing with an IPS is that if you're not careful, you can actually be DOS'd by an advanced attacker because they know that you have IPSs on in your network. For example, if target A is, or company A is dealing with company B, and the attacker knows the company B's IP range, what they can do is spoof IP packets and then send a bunch of items they know are going to be hit as being positive into company A. So company A is going to think company B is attacking them, and then the IPS is going to start downing the IP range, downing the IP addresses, and no longer doing the communication back and forth with the legitimate customer or upstream vendor. So with an IPS, there is the possibility of attacking a system and then using their own protection scheme against them. So that's one of the dangers of it. And I know with a lot of the IDSs, when you upgrade them, like for example Cisco, by default they're now IPS. Sometimes you actually have to turn off the IPS capability with the new iOSs. So
does IDS typically do remediation?
No, IDS just does flagging. And that's one of the things as far as it's kind of like antivirus that way. As soon as the signature comes through, and then it says, yes, you potentially are being attacked. So of course, you're going to be a lot of false positives, just like antivirus as well. And another thing as far as the quote-unquote advanced attackers, the majority of IDSs, and IPSs for that matter, will look specifically for things that they know are going to be out there. One of the beautiful things, like with buffer overflows, the majority of buffer overflows have what's called a NOP sled, or the traditional X90 in the hex. So whenever a string of X90s or a specific count of X90s are seen in a row, then the IDS or IPS will instantly say buffer overflows in progress or happening and alert you on it, or potentially even try to stop the traffic. What's interesting about that scenario is that, granted the advanced ones, there's a way around that as well, but even if it's a 0-day buffer overflow or a 0-day exploit, an IDS can still catch a lot of those because a lot of people are using the good old NOP sled. And whenever you look at, for example, like snort rules, you may see NOPS or NO-OPS or for no operations, but usually those are being caught. But again, like I mentioned before, if they're attacking the IPS, they may send a bunch of those in and try to kill the system. For example, there's a tool that's talked more about or more detail over in the other room for the advanced ethical hacker. It's called Sneeze. It grabs a bunch of the snort rules and then sends them to a targeted IP address. And the whole reason for that is to trip an IDS, to basically through a fog of war attack. You're sending so much garbage into there that anybody that's reading it is just going to be overloaded. And so your single attack or your few attacks are probably just going to slide right in with the rest of them. Or you can do it to where you're spoofing the traffic and then pretend to be a specific IP address and then get them banned for a specific period of time or whatnot through the IPS. So that's definitely a fun technology to play with, just as long as you realize that there could potentially be some other issues along with that as well. And then also with the single sign-on. Who can give a couple examples of single sign-on? That's one. Then also, how many people use the Microsoft? Good old Hotmail or MSNIM? Yeah, Passport. They have their own single sign-on. And I know a lot of corporations or companies on the commercial side, for example, like websites, will integrate with the Passport, basically saying you can either set up an account through us or you can set one up through Microsoft, and Microsoft keeps a hold of their user base, basically. So the Passports is a single sign-on technology. It's just not the same as a lot of other organizations are starting to push as well. There's also ad hoc, which is fun. from a pen tester side, a lot of ad hoc single sign-on usually has a lot of scripts, and within scripts, there's usually going to be passwords and so forth. So, okay, roles of access control. Basically, you want a collection of controls to limit the control system access, access to assets, information, and configuration features. Then also access based on identity, groups, and clearance, need to know, physical and logical location, and more. I know there's some technology that actually uses GPS to see where you physically are, so you can be validated, not only who you are, by what you have, let's say multiple authentication features, username, password, possibly even some sort of key, but then the GPS says, well, you should only be authenticated in this specific location. If you're 1,000 miles away, you're obviously not who you say you are because that wasn't set up beforehand, or if you are, you're no longer in the authorized area, so you can no longer log in.
They do stuff like that too, like if you're in another country and you can't use export rules against certain information.
So, definitely some interesting things that'll probably happen in the near future. I know, for example, a lot of the cameras have GPS as well, so they may eventually integrate some of that in there. How many people know what EXIF information is? EXIF information? Basically, that's extra information that's put into a, say, for example, like a JPG. So whenever you have a digital camera and you take a picture, it's going to have the header information, which is either the YOYA or the JFIF. And then right after that, that's when the EXIF information starts. And that's basically header information, extra stuff for the JPEG. So all that can be taken out and the image can still be seen. It's not going to harm it at all. But the stuff that's in the EXIF is going to be, for example, a camera, make, model, time, aperture of the camera. Sometimes, depending on the camera, I have seen, for example, like user information, if it's going through the setup and it asks you for that. And then also some of the new cameras are doing GPS, so you can tell where in the world the picture was taken. And then a lot of the cameras now are also doing MD5s of the actual image. So if the image is altered, then you can tell if that's the case as well. So EXIF. And that's primarily used in forensics, but can also be used from an attacker perspective. Because how many people here use Facebook, MySpace, or anything like that? A lot of people will take pictures with their digital camera and then instantly upload the picture, take them off their camera, and put them onto the web. So from an attacker perspective, if they have specific targets or within a company, what they'll do is they'll grab those, download them, and look at the EXIF and see if they can find anything interesting. Because it could just be a make and model of a camera. From an investigative standpoint, I've seen scenarios where people said that the pictures they took were not on company time, they were on their own time, things like that, so they shouldn't be in trouble if they're inappropriate or whatnot. And then looking further, you look at the image, you can tell it was on company time, it was with a company camera, and then sometimes I have heard a case with a guy that worked with a law enforcement agency. Somebody was doing that within his organization, and in one of the pictures, they actually were able to get the reflection of the VIN number off the windshield. And said not only was it company time, company camera, but company vehicle too. So,
What tool are you using to read that?
sorry?
What tool are you using to read that?
Basically, you can use any ASCII viewer, any forensics tool will do it. There's a lot of freeware tools that are just specifically for EXIF, which makes it nice because when you look at those, then it's one of the scenarios to where it breaks everything out where it's pretty.
Right.
But technically, you can just drag and drop the JPEG into Notepad and then still see the stuff. You just have to know where the information starts. So, but yeah, the EXIF can carry some interesting data. But yeah, going back to GPS, sometimes it has the GPS coordinates as well. So a lot of the items are starting to be GPS. And I know a lot of the phones have GPS built into them. So how many people here play with Ncase? Ncase, the servlets for the enterprise option. I know that they've been talking about it in the past. I don't know if they're actually able to release it yet, but they were working on like BlackBerry and cell phone servlets. So if you have the enterprise capability, you can actually do the forensics on the phones remotely and get their GPS information as well. So, okay, definitions. These are something that you basically just need to burn into your brain. Subject. This is an active entity that accesses an object. This could be a user or an individual. It could be a piece of software or an application or process. Object. is passive entity that is being accessed by a subject. Subject is an active entity that accesses an object. This could be a user or an individual. It could be a piece of software or an application or process. Object is passive entity that is being accessed by a subject. Access is data that flows from an object to a subject. Access control is controlling how the subjects and objects interact. Access privileges, permissions denying or defining the extent of the access. And access rules, basically these are statements for the access control. Then access path, this is path that requests travel through from the subject to the object. The access control, as mentioned before, there's the physical, the administrative, and then the technical. And those are the types of access controls and layers. This is basically the first line of defense against unauthorized entry to access, and also in-depth defense is critical in access protection by using these. But each one of these can have the different types of the methods. And again, there's physical, which would be your locks. And locks are basically just there to keep the honest people out, unless it's an advanced lock. I know that some of the locks, instead of just having the pins and cylinders, actually have, for example, like mushroom pins or mushroom heads on the pins, which basically means that they're going to be lock resistant. So when anybody is trying to turn the cylinder with the lockpick set, while they're trying to pick it, as soon as it gets to a certain level, the mushroom head is going to catch on the edge of the cylinder and not allow the rest of the pin to go up. So again, those aren't lock proof, but they're lock resistant. And then you can get even further. I know a lot of people are using some of the electronic dial locks because you're not going to hear the click, 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 and then a different tone within the click on a normal pad or whatnot. But a lot of the locks are definitely more advanced than they used to be. But your just basic locks are definitely going to be there to keep the honest people out. Security guards, controlling access to facility or equipment. Security guard. Is that going to be a detective, a preventative control? Which one is it more likely going to be? It's kind of a trick question. Both a detective and a preventative. Because when people see a security guard, they're going to come through, and they're probably going to be less likely to do something that they normally would do. And it could also be a corrective. Because again, if they're carrying anything or if they have a canine unit, then it's going to correct the action in progress that person's stealing something or running away from the facility.
I have a question. When you're doing your penetration testing, when you run into situations where you have key card swipes for server rooms and things like
Yes.
that, what is the, is that to keep the honest people out rationale too?
Well, yes.
Or is that a little more, or like to keep better?
If it's just a key swipe, it's to keep the honest people out because you can easily reproduce a magnetic strip. The harder ones to reproduce are going to be the smart cards, which actually have a computer chip on it.
Right.
But if it's a magnetic strip, that's reproducible. The RFID or RFI as well, those proximity cards, also keeping the honest people honest because you can reproduce those relatively cheaply by basically going to Radio Shack, looking at some of the specs online and building your own for not very much. And then basically you can read it and then reproduce it. There's several videos online that actually are showing people do this. They have this big bulky thing. So of course the smaller it is, the more expensive it is. There's also commercial ones as well probably. But the individual got a guy from one of the state governments. He got his card, swiped it through one of his antennas that he had, and then he took his laptop over to a door with a proximity reader on it, and then of course hit send, and then it opened up the door for him. So again, those, depending on the sophistication of the attacker, can also be easily fooled or reproduced. But if you have a pin, then basically they're going to have to do some sort of shoulder surfing or watch the guy through a camera or whatnot to get it, or some way of finding out his pin. The other issue, a lot of people will have, let's say, swipe and a pin by a door, but they also have a lock. So that's probably one of the worst things you can do, is because the lock's going to be easier to pick, and the people that when they open the door with the lock, that's not going to set off the alarms. So if you do have a system like that, that's probably not very good. Is that it should either A, be by a lock, or B, by swipe card and pin number, or proximity and pin number. So yeah, there are several things I've also seen. For example, depending on the environment as well, it could be like I mentioned there, doors like the one behind us have it to where the bolt is actually curved from the inside out. If there's enough space to insert any sort of metal or stiff object or whatnot, you can sometimes capture that and pull it to where the doors are no longer sticking together and then they just open. If you do not have the sensors pushed to where you have to swipe to disengage the the alarm system or the trigger. Sometimes you can just open the door without even swiping anything. So it also depends on how it's set up. But the majority of the ones that are set up are relatively good because the sensors are connecting, and if you don't swipe, it doesn't turn that off. Okay, again, technical. This can be your encryption, your passwords and tokens, and biometrics. And biometrics is definitely a fun one to play with. And then administrative, policies and security awareness training. As mentioned before, these are the control services. So you can have preventative, detective, corrective, deterrent, recovering, compensation. Each one of those are basically characteristics of the previous three. So with that being said, any one of these can be physical, technical, or administrative. Like I mentioned before, like a security guard, again, depending on the tools that you're able to give the security guard, such as either a K9 unit or potentially guns or whatnot, or those good old shock sticks, could be preventative, or usually is, because people see it, and most people are going to be scared away from breaking into a specific area with guards in it. Because again, that's going to be preventative and then detective, because some technology will basically see things and they won't pick up on the quote-unquote human instinct, that gut feeling. So a lot of guards, when they see something that they just don't see as being right, it could basically state that, yeah, that person, we're going to have to watch him, or let's ask them questions, see if they should be here. When on technology, you might be able to fake that. Okay, this area, we cover identification, authentication, authorization, also authentication technologies, and access control methods. And again, throughout this whole thing and throughout the whole CISSP, we're going to try to go back to these type of access control characteristics through the physical, technical, and administrative. Okay, this area, who you are, identification, basically subject supply identification information such as username, user ID, or account number. This is going to be public information, and it's something where you should never authenticate anybody with just one piece of information, because that's something that's going to be probably easily sniffed or easily obtained. Because a lot of times you can easily, a lot of people use, for example, usernames would be first name, last initial, last name, first initial. It could even be first name dot last name. There's a lot of naming conventions that people use that are easy to guess, especially if it's numeric. Then again, if it's numeric, yeah, it's relatively easy to guess as well. Okay, within the authentication, you have the public information for the identification. The authentication basically needs something that only that individual, only that asset or entity would have, which would be, for example, passphrase, PIN, biometric, one-time password, a key, basically something to validate that that public information is actually legitimate. And what a lot of people will start to do as well is they'll use two forms of the authentication, or two different layers. So once they go through the two different layers, that's one real big push for the single sign-on, is because they go through this heavy process of trying to authenticate who the user is, what the access they have is, and then once they're in the environment, then they should be trusted all throughout. Okay, the authorization portion, different from the authentication. Authorization, using a criteria to make a determination of the operations that subject can carry out on specific objects. This is a definite issue, is that you can have an individual. They can authenticate into a system, so they can log in, but doesn't necessarily mean they're authorized to do anything in that environment. So you could have, for example, a lower than guest account to where the only thing they could do is get into an empty folder and potentially put in a text file into that folder so other people can then validate what information they have. So you can have the authorization portion to where you actually have no authorization. Okay, authentication mechanisms and characteristics. It's, again, something you know, which is going to be password, passphrase. I know a lot of people are starting to use the customized smart phrases or whatnot, to where, like, what's your mother's maiden name? The challenge is, if you're a target and somebody spends enough time doing the research on you, they'll be able to find out that information as well. So it's not the best thing in the world, especially favorite color. Sometimes you can even brute force that. Common one would be red, blue, or whatnot, but if you use a strange color, that's probably going to be harder to tell. But sometimes you can social engineer that information out as a person as well. And that is usually easier than getting your actual password. Something you have, such as smart card where a lot of people are using the CACs now. I know a lot of the USBs as well will have some smart technology to it as well. And then biometrics. Biometrics, there's a lot of different types of biometrics, and the big issue with biometrics is the psychological acceptability versus price and reliability. Because with the good old fingerprint, theoretically no one's going to have the same fingerprint, but with statistical analysis or the good old birthday attack with encryption, eventually somebody's going to have the same fingerprint. It's just everybody hasn't been fingerprinted yet. Yeah, there's only so many possibilities in this geographic scale. But with that said, fingerprints are easy to fake as well. How many people have seen Mythbusters, the episode where they broke the biometrics? Basically, they had a couple different scenarios. And this was funny because they heard the thing on the internet, and this was proven at DEF CON, but the good old gummy fingerprints. And so once you use it, you eat the fingerprint or the evidence and it's gone. They went through ballistics gel instead because they have so much of that in stock. But the first couple times it failed. So then they got the idea, let's blow it up. And they found out whenever they took the fingerprint wasn't perfect at all. It had all kinds of breaks in the ridges and the lines and whatnot. So they blew it up and they got a Sharpie and they filled in the ridges so it was actually solid fingerprint. Then they shrunk it back down and they rebuilt the fingerprint through ballistics gel. And then it got through the computer thumbprint scanner that's on a lot of the computers that come out today. It bypassed that automatically. Then it went through a couple different door biometrics as well, and it went through that. And what was interesting was that then they got the idea, well, the ballistic gel works great once you fix the fingerprint. Let's try printing it off on a piece of paper. Excuse me. That bypassed the computer biometrics fingerprint scanner, and same thing with the door lock fingerprint scanner. And then I know a lot of people are trying to push the body heat versus the fingerprint, so you can tell that it's an actual real item. But on a technicality with that, you could probably hold the ballistics gel in your hand long enough to get it to body temperature and then push it on as quick as you can and still probably fool some of the biometric fingerprint scanners. The retina ones are going to be, of course, a little bit harder. But one of the things that a lot of people don't like with retina, some of the older technology, actually blew air into your eye to get a better picture, so it was uncomfortable. The iris scanners are almost as accurate as the retina, but the issue with that is where the iris scanner actually is, because some of them you can be 5-10 feet away and it gets a good picture, but if there's glare off of a window or if you're wearing glasses, then it makes it to where there's a big issue there as well. But yeah, with biometrics, definitely fun technology, but as with all other access controls, there's sometimes ways to bypass them. Okay, strong authentication. It's having some sort of two-factor authentication. On a technicality, biometrics is something you have and something you are, because it's your fingerprint, which is something you have, and you can't get rid of, or you can get rid of it, but it's painful, and then something you are. But basically what they want is some sort of like biometrics and a password, smart card and a PIN. Again, smart cards can be something you have. A PIN, you should probably have some sort of password with a smart card, because PIN numbers are usually anywhere from 4 to 8 characters, which means it's a very small, very weak password. And usually they're numeric, so which means it's even worse. I know a lot of people, this is the fun thing, when, from an attacker perspective, they'll look for patterns. Because a lot of people will do specific patterns on the keypad. Either they'll do words on the keypad, or they'll do patterns like go all around a circle, or I guess the square on your keypad, or do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 1, 2, 3, 7, or I guess it'd be 7, 8, 9, and then 4, 5, 6. So if you can easily brute force, and a lot of programs will do that as well from the technological side. But yeah, if you just do shoulder surfing, and if it's a 4-character PIN, you steal the smart card, it's easy to authenticate to somebody.
So for the test, is the biometric considered a 2 or a 1?
It's 1.
Okay.
It is going to be something you are. So, and going back to here, this is basically something you just need to memorize for the test. And for almost every security test you're going to come across. Is something you know is a password, passphrase, could be a smart pass, something you have, token some sort, and then biometrics is something you are. And then there's the case in Malaysia. Speaking of thumb scans, this individual bought a higher-end vehicle, and it had a keyless entry system, but the keyless entry was thumb scan. What ended up happening was he got carjacked. And during the process of carjacking, the thieves realized that they couldn't start the car without the guy's thumb, so they chopped the thumb off. So he only has, I guess, 9 more tries. Yeah, two-factor authentication, not a username and password. You have to have something else as well. I know a lot of people have a soft token on the system, so they'll have some sort of file that could be on the hard drive, so only that one computer or only that person with the actual token can log in. The danger of that is the storage of the token. Because if you have physical access, 9 times out of 10, you own the system. Because no matter what they're doing to secure the system, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be able to, for example, boot it up off of a live CD, live Linux, or Windows through the BART PE, and then get into the data. Yes?
Now, some places are using, for physical token, they're using key fob now. A lot of places are.
Yep.
As the, I guess it's the second part of the authentication.
And if they're using the key file, if you boot up off of a, like a live Linux CD, you can just copy that file onto a USB and then put that file on the other system you want to connect to. So you can bypass that relatively easy if it's just a file that's going through. But if the file is built off of some of the system information, that's different. Because then they have to basically reproduce all of the variables that make that system unique.
Right.
So then they, one of the only ways you'd have to, or could do that, is have insider knowledge on the algorithm that builds that variable set. So, but yeah, I know a lot of tokens are not directly for the system. They're basically built on a server and then sent to the individual system, and then they put it on to like their C drive or somewhere specific like that, and it's only as secure as the storage unit on there. But if you are doing it to where it is generated off of your system itself using specific variables, that's going to be the best way to generate it. Okay, access criteria components. Of course, security clearance, mandatory access control systems, and security labels. Security clearance basically, again, is if you're going to be a guest account, power user, or administrator. And then security label is a specific item, would be that only guests could use it, or unclassified SBU can see it, or potentially even a secret can see it. And what's interesting about this as well is you could have the specific access rights, but if you don't have the need to know, that's the third factor in more secure systems. Because the need to know is a formal information process may be used, requirements of the role within the company to access the asset or data. There's least privilege. This is another thing that is going to ring within probably half the questions of the CISSP, is the least privilege issue, which is least amount of rights and permissions required to carry out specific tasks. And authorized creep does not follow this. So which basically means that if you have, say, sales staff that needs to get access to a specific database, they should have access to that specific database. They should not have access to anything else, such as the HR database, only the customer database to sell your content or sell your product with. But this is a huge issue, especially with people that were administrators in the past. Sometimes an administrator will either be promoted or demoted, depending on how you look at it, to management. And when they're management, they still have the access rights from the admin days, along with the access rights for the management side. So they're still able to do a lot of things that they shouldn't be able to do. When it comes down to it, because their role changed, all the rights from their previous role should be wiped out, and then only the rights from the new role should be given. Default to no access, unless explicitly allowed, is implicitly denied. That's another big issue, especially with CISSP. For routers, for example, access control lists, you should deny any, and then basically do what's called a whitelist, and only allow what you absolutely trust into that item, or into the ability to access the data you're trying to protect. This is a huge issue, and going back to like the directory transversal from yesterday, people kept trying to blacklist and they didn't whitelist, and that was the problem where when they fixed something, then it wasn't really fixed. It just made it to where the attack had to change just a little bit to canicalize the information from the .. / to like the 5C. Okay, now the access control mechanisms in use today. You have your biometrics, retina scans, fingerprint, and voice print. Again, one of the failures of voice print is if the person has a bad cold, laryngitis, things like that, it's going to alter it. I guess also if they're on speed. There's token devices. There's synchronous and asynchronous devices. memory cards, good old ATM and proximity cards. There's smart cards, credit cards, identification cards. Some of the credit cards today do have the computer chips built into them. I know our friends across the pond, that's a common thing, and a lot of places will not take American-based credit cards because we only have the magnetic strip.
I know a lot of the financial institutions are also issuing
Yeah.
smart cards just for people at home.
And a lot of people are not doing it company-wise because of the cost involved. Instead of it being, for example, 50 cents to $2 per magnetic card, you're looking at, like, say, $5 to $10 per smart card. But the investment is probably going to be a lot better in the long run if they're going to be using that same card for 5 years versus any theft or damages that could be done during that time. As far as all the things we've covered so far, what's really interesting, and just as I guess a word of advice with identification, you never want to give too much information or give any more than you absolutely have to. Going back down to the fail-safe or the least privilege issue, give everybody else least privilege to your info. There was this reporter in the UK that went through, and he was probably not the brightest bulb in the pack, because he went through and wrote an article saying that all these stories about people's bank accounts getting hijacked by attackers, that's just a load. I don't believe it. And to prove it, I'm going to put my bank account information, such as the bank number, routing number. And the next day he made several charitable donations to entities. So what ended up happening was, of course, somebody grabbed that information, probably social engineered people at the bank, and then transferred money out of it. Then there was the issue with the guy that had his credit card number on the side of a vehicle and saying that you use my service, you're completely safe. Nobody's ever going to be able to hijack your accounts. He, yeah, he put his social on the side of a vehicle. He got attacked. So they did find it, but by then it was too late because they already set up a loan. Yeah. Well, that was a recent thing. So it's one of the scenarios to where, going back again to least privilege, is that any information could potentially be too much information. So you always want to minimize what you give, not only from a personal perspective, from a business perspective as well. I know a lot of applications, especially web apps, that will, for example, if you're testing for cross-site scripting or SQL injection, you break the variable, and instead of it giving you the generic error saying something occurred, if it continues, please contact administrator or try again. It will give you the dump file of where the physical file is located. For example, like the e:/inetpub/www.root/whatnot. So that gives you potentially the version of whatever application they're running, the actual application name. A lot of times they even give you variables. And I'll pop up a page here. It's still vulnerable after about 2 years after I told them about it. But basically, it's vulnerable to cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and information leakage, because it is going to an SQL database, and then it actually gives you the database name, basically the records, and then the ID fields, so the column names as well. So, yep, very cool, especially from an attacker's perspective. You also have your cryptographic keys or private key. Okay, biometrics. Again, these use a unique personal attribute for authentication purposes. Verifies individual's identity based on psychological or behavioral characteristics or sociological, and also most expensive, sophisticated, and accurate way of identifying individuals. Society has a low acceptance rate depending on the item. I know fingerprinting, a lot of people do not like the idea of somebody fingerprinting them. Yeah, I went till I was about 25 before I ever got fingerprinted. And then I know a lot of people that haven't been fingerprinted their whole lives. But I know a lot of banks are forcing that if you want to cash a check. Yep, government. Yeah, if you're going to get your little white card signed, you have to get the fingerprinted just to be able to be accepted for a job or be considered for one. Yeah, that's another fun thing is if you have a friend going to get their verification or their cards or the fingerprints done, tell them to do the pink one instead of the white one. See what happens, because that's for criminal records. So, but how many people here have been to Disney before? Disney World or Disneyland. I've heard some reports of people that have gone there recently that now they're starting to do fingerprinting. And one of the ways that they're pushing it is saying that they're looking for potentially lost kids. but they're trying to basically see who's coming in and then keeping records of it. It's not public knowledge on how they're protecting the data or what exactly it's being used for, but if you leave and, for example, if you want to come back, instead of checking your ID, basically they're checking your fingerprint.